One of the first things you want to do when you buy a new table saw, or if you haven't already done it to the saw you have, is replace the blade insert with a zero clearance insert. You can buy these aftermarket or make them yourself. They're really easy to make yourself. The reason you want to do this is because the insert that comes with it has a gap on either side of the blade. So what winds up happening is when you cut, especially if it's a small offcut, it'll have a tendency to get jammed down in this opening. The other thing a zero clearance insert does is it will keep the board from tearing out because it'll be supported underneath the blade. So when you use a circular saw, for instance, the bottom of the cut always gets torn up. That's essentially what you're doing upside down on the table saw. So if you have a zero clearance insert in it, it's going to back that board up and the workpiece won't get torn up. As I said, you can buy these already made for pretty much any saw out there, but they're really easy to make yourself. You want to use the one that comes with your saw, and you'll use it as a pattern. And we're going to template route around it. And then I'll show you how to set it back in place, raise the blade, and make it into a zero clearance insert. It's really pretty quick. And when you make a zero clearance insert, you're going to want to start with a stable and smooth-faced material. Melamine, kind of like what's on this fence, works really well. I'm using Baltic birch plywood. It's got a smooth face. You put a coat of wax on it after you're done, it works just fine. This is 1/2 inch. With most saws, that's going to do a good job. First thing I did was kind of rip this board down to about a 1/16 wider than the insert that came with the saw. And I just ran a long length of them. You're going to want to make a couple of these. I think I made about a dozen of them 10 years ago, and I just grabbed them when one gets torn up for one reason or another. You'll want to have a lot of them on hand, and they're easy to make once you get them roughed out. So just go ahead and have a lot there. To template route it, what I've done, had it cut to size, ripped to size, and then I've set this in place and just traced around it with a pencil, went to the bandsaw and roughed out the shape. Again, it's just a little bit wider than the pencil line I've drawn. And then I will sandwich these together using carpet tape, double-sided tape. I think this is one of the most underrated tools in the shop, is probably good double-sided tape. I think I use it every day for something. You can see I also lined up the hole on this and drilled it just like it was on the original. So I'll put it down in just that same position, making sure I have a little bit of material on all sides to remove. Then I'll clamp it up and template route around it using just a flush trim bit and a little laminate trimmer. So once you get them taped together, you want to make sure that you've got just a little bit of material on the outside of the original insert, so you are actually removing something when you template route it. And then you'll clamp it down to the work surface. I'm going to use just a flush trim bit like you would use for cleaning up veneer tape to template route this. The bearing on the bit is on the end of it, so you're just going to line up the bearing and make sure it aligns with the original template itself. So I'm going to flip this around and clamp it up the other way, but before I do that, you're going to want to take a look and see what you're going to run into. Here we've got a positioning pin on the front of it. And there's also a gap here where the splitter for the saw comes through. Just pay attention to those. You're going to want to reposition it. And just don't route those. You can clean those up later with a belt sander or a rasp or really anything. So just skip those as you're routing. Once you get it clamped back up, just route the other side. That should do it. And once you get these few spots here cleaned up, it should fit right into the opening like the original one did. So once you get the two separated, just take it to the belt sander, clean up those few rough spots you left on the end, and then you're ready to set it in place. One thing I ran into on this saw, which I haven't run into before, is that the blade won't go all the way down. So I can't just set that in place. Normally you would set it in place, make sure this is clamped down in some way, and then raise the blade slowly. Well, you can't do that here because the blade won't let it sit all the way down. Figured out a quick solution to that, though, in case you ever run into the same problem. Just going to go back to the insert that came with your saw. Bring the fence over and line up the edge of the fence exactly with the edge of the original insert. So you'll be cutting exactly where that blade is, and you're just going to raise the blade just a little bit. You're not going to cut all the way through it, just enough so that you'll be able to set this down completely when it goes back in place. So I've just cut a groove here on the underside of it. That should allow it to sit down. So then you can set this back in place. And that groove should just go over the saw blade. Take it as low as you can. And that should work fine. Make sure the blade's down all the way. You can kind of use this as a gauge for where your blade is, because you'll need to know that. You know your blade is somewhere in this area. The easiest way to do this with the Biesmeyer fences, which most fences are either a Biesmeyer or some takeoff on it nowadays. The easiest thing to do is just bring it over. You don't want it where the blade's going to cut, but you want it at least covering, 2/3 of the plate. Bring the fence over as far as you can, and then you're going to just slowly raise the blade with the saw running. And that's where the blade is going to come through every time you cut now. So I know that sounded a little rough, but it was actually a safe thing to do. With this pulled over, there's really, even though it's rattling, there's nowhere the insert could go as you're cutting. So it works fine just raising that blade slowly. As you'll see, we're making a zero clearance insert. This is why it's called that. When you raise the blade now, there's no gap on either side of it. So this is going to make it much smoother on the bottom side of whatever you're cutting. The other thing you'll notice is this is recessed about 1/8 of an inch. That's with 1/2 inch plywood. So what we want to do is go in. They've got these little positioning tabs here. And I'm going to take screws and put in the bottom side just to raise that up, and you can adjust the screws up or down so that you'll be able to bring this level. To do this, I've taken the original insert and a square and just found the center point. It happens to be the same center point on both sides. So you can pull a line there, as I've done, and then on the sides of it, you can come in, put it back in the same position, and then just eyeball the location and mark them on the edge, and then simply transfer that line over. That'll give you a spot where you want the center of your screw to be. So what I'm doing now is just putting a couple of screws in here. And these are going to work to level that plate as we put it in. So I'll mark the holes with an awl, and then I'm pre-drilling just a shallow hole. And these are 1/2-inch screws, but I'm going into 1/2-inch stock, and I know I'm not going to go anywhere near full depth, so those should work fine. So once you get all 4 in, go ahead and set it in place. And what we want to do is level it up front and back so that it's level with the table saw on all the edges. It should be level. A little high here. If it's high, you just drive the screw in a little more, test it again. It's worth taking the time to get this nice and level, because with some cuts it'll actually allow your workpiece to go lower than you want, so it's worth taking a few minutes to do this right. You won't have to do it but one time. That feels good. It looks nice and level on all 4 sides. So that's really it. As I said earlier, melamine does a good job of this. I'm just using Baltic birch. I'm going to put a quick coat of wax on it. And that should allow all your workpieces to slide smoothly across it and make your work a lot safer. The other thing you want to do is go ahead and make a couple of these. This one, the reason, I was giving these a hard time earlier, the reason they have a wide gap in these is because it has to accommodate the blade when it goes for an angle, or when you even do a dado cut, although this one's a little small for a dado. But it does have to accommodate that angled cut. So they can't produce them with a zero clearance like you can make. So what you want to do is make different inserts for different cuts. You want one for 45 degrees, one for 90 degrees, and then keep a few on hand, because you're always going to have odd cuts that you need to make, that you need them to be safe, and you need a good clean cut, so it's worth using up one of your inserts to do that. They're quick to make. And as I said, just put on a little bit of wax. They should work fine, keep everything running smoothly.